Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. It was Christmas Eve, 2002, and Modesto, California, was cloaked in festive lights, carolers' voices, and the scent of fresh pine. In a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, a house at 523 Covina Avenue stood adorned with holiday decorations. Inside, 27-year-old Laci Peterson, 8 months pregnant with her first child, was supposed to be wrapping presents and preparing for a family dinner. But by early afternoon, Laci had vanished without a trace. What began as a missing persons case would soon spiral into one of the most sensational murder trials in American history. Laci Denise Rocha was born on May 4, 1975, in Modesto, California. From a young age, she was known for her bright smile, vibrant energy, and love of animals. After her parents, Sharon and Dennis, divorced, Laci remained close to her mother and older half-sister, Amy. She grew up in a tight-knit family, spending her teen years on a farm where she learned responsibility and the value of hard work. Friends remembered her as warm-hearted, driven, and deeply caring. In the mid-1990s, Laci met Scott Peterson while visiting a friend at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. Scott was a handsome, charismatic student studying agricultural business. He loved golf, fishing, and had an easy, laid-back charm that drew people in. The two quickly fell into a serious relationship. Laci was smitten. Friends said she believed she had met her soulmate, someone she could build a life and family with. They married in August 1997. Laci supported Scott's dreams, including his idea of opening a sports bar. They eventually settled in Modesto, close to Laci's family. In 2000, Scott took a job as a fertilizer salesman, earning a modest income. Laci worked as a substitute teacher and focused on turning their modest house into a cozy home. To the outside world, they seemed like the ideal couple. They were photogenic, successful, and excited to start a family. By the fall of 2002, Laci was 8 months pregnant with a boy they planned to name Connor. She decorated the nursery with soft blues and animal motifs. Her baby shower had been held just weeks earlier, and she had already chosen a pediatrician. She took daily walks around the neighborhood with their golden retriever, Mackenzie, and often visited friends and family. She was glowing, full of anticipation for motherhood. December 23, 2002 was a typical day. Laci spoke with her mother, Sharon Rocha, and the two discussed Christmas Eve plans. Sharon said Laci sounded relaxed and cheerful. That night, Laci and Scott watched television together, and she planned to bake cookies the next morning for the family gathering. On the morning of December 24th, Scott later told police he left home around 9:30 a.m. to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, an unusual choice for Christmas Eve. According to his account, Laci was still home when he left, planning to mop the floors, walk the dog, and prepare for the evening. But by early afternoon, concern grew when Laci's stepfather, Ron Gransky, noticed she hadn't shown up for the family meal. Scott returned home around 5 p.m. and called Sharon to report Laci missing. His tone was calm, almost detached. The Petersons called police, and by that evening, a missing persons report was filed. Friends, family, and neighbors sprang into action. Flyers were printed, search parties organized, and local media picked up the story. Mackenzie, their dog, had been found wandering the neighborhood earlier that day, wearing his leash. That detail raised eyebrows immediately. Detectives began canvassing the area. They interviewed neighbors and checked traffic cameras. Laci's car was still in the driveway. Her purse, keys, and phone were inside the house. There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle. Her sunglasses sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Scott's alibi, a solo fishing trip on Christmas Eve, struck many as odd. He said he drove to Berkeley Marina, 90 miles away, and fished in the cold bay for a few hours. When asked what he was fishing for, he was vague. His receipt showed he had paid for parking. Police began investigating quietly, trying not to alarm Scott or the public. They knew that in such cases, the husband is statistically the most likely suspect. What they didn't know yet was that Scott had been living a double life. In the days that followed, Laci's face was everywhere. Candlelight vigils were held. National media outlets arrived in Modesto. Sharon and Ron made tearful pleas on television, begging for Laci's safe return. Volunteers searched fields, rivers, and highways. Hundreds of tips poured in. Scott appeared on camera, but something about his demeanor felt off. He was emotionless, composed, and even smiled inappropriately during interviews. In one infamous moment, he casually referred to Laci in the past tense just days after her disappearance. Behind the scenes, Scott was hiding a secret that would shatter public perception. While the world searched for his pregnant wife, Scott was having an affair. Amber Fry, a 27-year-old massage therapist from Fresno, came forward in early January 2003. She had met Scott in November 2002, just weeks before Laci vanished. Scott told Amber he was a widower, that his wife had died. Amber was horrified when she saw him on the news. She contacted police and agreed to record her conversations with him. The recordings revealed Scott telling lie after lie. He continued to pretend his wife was dead, even as search parties looked for her. He flirted with Amber, spoke about their future, and never mentioned Laci's pregnancy. Detectives now had a motive. Scott wanted a new life, free of responsibility and fatherhood, with his mistress. Scott's behavior became increasingly erratic. He sold Laci's car, considered selling the house, and seemed to move on with shocking speed. Public opinion turned against him. The media, once neutral, began to paint him as a cold, calculating killer. Protesters stood outside his house. Justice for Laci signs appeared across California. But there was still no body, no definitive proof of murder. The case hinged on circumstantial evidence. That would soon change. In April 2003, for months after Laci vanished, a couple walking along the San Francisco Bay shoreline made a gruesome discovery. The decomposed body of a late-term male fetus had washed ashore, followed days later by the partial remains of a woman. The fetus, with the umbilical cord still attached, had been expelled from the mother's body, a phenomenon known as coffin birth. The woman's torso was badly decomposed, missing limbs and a head. DNA confirmed the worst. The bodies were Laci and Connor Peterson. The discovery changed everything. Police arrested Scott on April 18, 2003, in La Jolla, California. He was found near a golf course with $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, camping gear, and his brother's ID. A clear sign he was trying to flee. His hair had been bleached blonde. He was charged with 2 counts of murder, one for Laci and one for the unborn child. The trial that followed would grip the nation. The sun rose quietly on December 25, 2002, over Modesto, California, but for the Rocha family and the Petersons, it was a day overshadowed by dread. The celebration of Christmas was a distant memory, replaced with desperate hope and gnawing fear. Laci Peterson, 8 months pregnant with her first child, had been missing for more than 24 hours, and the silence surrounding her disappearance was becoming deafening. The Modesto Police Department continued to comb the Peterson neighborhood, deploying officers and volunteers to knock on doors, revisit the park where Laci had allegedly been walking the dog, and interview potential witnesses. They searched trash bins, creeks, and alleyways. The scent of panic began to permeate the community. Flyers bearing Laci's face spread across town, her smile frozen in time, her round belly a poignant reminder of the unborn baby she carried, Connor. The case had begun to draw media attention. A local station aired a segment on the missing woman, and within hours, regional news outlets picked it up. By the following day, the story of the missing pregnant woman from Modesto was being shared nationally. With Christmas behind them and a lull in other news, the networks had space to fill, and Laci's story gripped viewers. a beautiful young woman, the promise of new life, and a husband's heartbreak. It had all the elements of a tragedy unfolding in real time. Scott Peterson appeared before the cameras, giving short, controlled statements. He talked about Laci, her beauty, her kindness, her excitement about becoming a mother. He appealed for her safe return, his voice steady, his eyes betraying no emotion. Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, stood beside him, her face pale, her eyes red from sleepless nights and relentless crying. She spoke less than Scott, but radiated raw grief. But behind the scenes, the cracks had already begun to show. The Modesto Police Department's early interviews with Scott raised several red flags. He stated that he had last seen Laci on the morning of December 24th, around 9:30 a.m. She was curling her hair, preparing to mop the floor and walk the dog, while Scott claimed he was preparing for a fishing trip to the Berkeley Marina, a strange choice for Christmas Eve. Officers noted that Scott's timeline seemed rehearsed, and his demeanor lacked urgency. While his wife and unborn son were missing, he appeared calm, too calm. Laci's family began to ask questions. Why hadn't Scott called them sooner? Why had he gone fishing that day instead of staying close to home during the holiday? Why did he seem emotionally detached? The discomfort grew quietly, unspoken at first, as the family tried to focus on finding Laci. But the whispers started. As detectives dug into Scott's story, they discovered inconsistencies. He told different people different details about where he had gone fishing and what he had been doing. At one point, he said he had gone to the marina to fish for sturgeon. Another time, he said he was targeting striped bass. When asked to pinpoint the exact location where he had launched his boat, he was vague. Officers found this suspicious. His trip to the marina had taken him over an hour away from home. A curious decision for a man whose wife was 8 months pregnant and expected to give birth in less than a month. The detectives followed the standard protocol, canvassing the area, requesting surveillance footage, reviewing Laci's cell phone records and activity. They found no signs of Laci leaving home on her own. The house showed no evidence of a struggle. The couple's golden retriever, Mackenzie, had been found wandering the neighborhood with his leash on, an ominous detail. Laci's purse, keys, and wallet were still at home. Nothing made sense. Within a few days, the Modesto police brought in cadaver dogs and search and rescue teams. They scoured the park where Laci walked, the Berkeley Marina, and several bodies of water nearby. Divers searched beneath the surface. Tips poured in from across California, sightings of Laci at gas stations in neighboring towns on highways, but none led to anything substantial. Then, just days after Laci was reported missing, detectives received a phone call that shifted everything. A woman named Amber Fry contacted the Modesto police with a shocking revelation. She had been dating Scott Peterson for several weeks. She had no idea he was married, let alone that his pregnant wife was now the subject of a national search. Amber told officers that Scott had portrayed himself as single. He had even mentioned that this would be his first Christmas without his wife, implying that he was a grieving widower. The revelation was explosive. Amber, a single mother and massage therapist living in Fresno, had met Scott in November through a mutual friend. Their romance had progressed quickly. She described Scott as charming, attentive, and romantic. He called her frequently, sent her flowers, and even spoke about their future together. He never once mentioned Laci. Amber was devastated. She had unknowingly become the other woman in what was now a murder investigation. The detectives, realizing the potential of Amber's testimony, asked her to cooperate. She agreed without hesitation. Over the next few weeks, Amber would record over 20 hours of conversations with Scott Peterson. During these calls, he never admitted to anything directly, but his tone was revealing. He seemed more concerned about how the media attention was affecting him than the fact that his wife was missing. Amber's cooperation gave police leverage. Publicly, they continued to support the notion that Scott was a grieving husband. Privately, they were building a case against him. Surveillance was placed on Scott. His phone was tapped. His movements were tracked. Detectives hoped he would slip up and say something damning. Meanwhile, the media circus grew. Satellite trucks lined the Peterson neighborhood. reporters camped outside the house. National networks ran specials on Laci's case. The pressure mounted. Scott, who had initially been treated with sympathy, was now being scrutinized. The public started to turn against him, especially after the news of his affair broke. The media painted a portrait of a narcissist, a man who couldn't be bothered to stay faithful to his pregnant wife, who went fishing on Christmas Eve while she vanished. Sharon Rocha and Laci's family were devastated by the revelation. They had initially defended Scott, believing him incapable of harming their daughter. But Amber's story shattered that belief. The heartbreak deepened. Not only was their daughter missing, but the man they had welcomed into their family had betrayed them in the most profound way. Despite the mounting suspicion, there was still no physical evidence. No body, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses. The case remained circumstantial. And yet, detectives believed they knew the truth. They just couldn't prove it, yet. In early January, the police held a press conference and, for the first time, officially named Scott Peterson as a person of interest. They stopped short of calling him a suspect, but the message was clear. He was no longer just the husband of a missing woman. He was under investigation. Scott's behavior grew stranger. He avoided the press. He refused polygraph tests. He sold Laci's car, considered selling their house, and appeared more concerned about protecting his own image than finding his wife. The public backlash intensified. Protesters stood outside the house, shouting. Talk shows dissected every detail. The nation was captivated and increasingly convinced of his guilt. Still, the investigators remained patient. They knew that without Laci's body, the case would be harder to prosecute. So they waited. They searched. They followed every lead, hoping the pieces would fall into place. Then in April 2003, almost 4 months after Laci disappeared, a break came in the most tragic form imaginable. Along the rocky shoreline of the San Francisco Bay, near the area where Scott had claimed to be fishing, the decomposed remains of a small male fetus were discovered. The following day, less than a mile away, the torso of an adult woman was found. She was missing her hands, feet, and head. DNA tests would later confirm what investigators already suspected. The remains were those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The discovery shattered any lingering hope. Laci was dead. Connor, who had been due in February, had been born post-mortem, expelled from his mother's body sometime after her death. The brutality of the crime horrified the public. The fact that her body had washed up so close to where Scott claimed to be fishing on the day she vanished seemed too coincidental to ignore. On April 18, 2003, the Modesto police arrested Scott Peterson in La Jolla, near the Mexican border. He had dyed his hair blonde, grown a goatee, and was carrying $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, and his brother's driver's license. Police believed he was attempting to flee. The arrest brought a strange sense of closure, but it was just the beginning of a long and emotional legal battle. The nation watched as the case against Scott Peterson shifted from search to prosecution. The man who had once stood beside a grieving mother-in-law was now accused of murdering his wife and unborn child. The trial, when it came, would grip the country like few others had before. And through it all, one question continued to haunt everyone watching. How could a man do this to the woman he once vowed to love and the child they had created together? After Scott Peterson's arrest on April 18, 2003, the nation exhaled in collective shock and morbid fascination. His transformation from charming husband to accused murderer had captivated the media, and now, with Laci and baby Connor's remains found, the prosecution was ready to reveal their case. But it wouldn't be easy. There were no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, and no confession. Everything hinged on circumstantial evidence, and whether a jury would find it compelling enough to convict. Scott was booked into Stanislaus County Jail and charged with 2 counts of murder, one for Laci and one for Connor. Under California law, the murder of an unborn child, if viable outside the womb, could be prosecuted separately. The public watched in stunned silence as he appeared in an orange jumpsuit, handcuffed, looking gaunt and expressionless. The man who had once played golf and smiled for wedding photos was now being called a monster. The media frenzy exploded. Television anchors speculated on motives. Talk shows dissected every piece of evidence that emerged. News vans lined up outside the courthouse in Modesto, forming a media circus so disruptive that the trial would eventually be moved 90 miles away to Redwood City to ensure a fair jury pool. Prosecutors believed the motive was clear. Scott wanted out. He didn't want to be a father, didn't want the responsibility, and didn't want to stay married to Laci. But instead of pursuing divorce, he chose murder. The affair with Amber Frey painted a damning picture. Here was a man who told his mistress, before his wife had even disappeared, that it would be his first Christmas without his wife. A man who shopped for pornographic pay-per-view channels in the days after Laci vanished. A man who sold his wife's car and tried to sell the house as if she were never coming back. But still, the case was complicated. Scott's defense team, led by Mark Garagos, argued that there was no physical evidence tying him to the murders. No fingerprints, no DNA, no blood. The evidence, they said, was entirely circumstantial, and the media had already convicted him in the court of public opinion. They insisted Scott was not a perfect man. Yes, he cheated, yes, he lied, but infidelity didn't make him a murderer. And they reminded the jury that police had initially followed hundreds of leads, many of which pointed away from Scott. Prosecutors countered with a meticulous timeline. They walked jurors through the days leading up to December 24th. Laci was last seen alive around 8:30 a.m. that morning by a neighbor. Around 10:08 a.m., a neighbor found the Petersons' golden retriever, Mackenzie, wandering the neighborhood, still wearing a leash, as if he had been let out suddenly. Yet Scott claimed Laci had taken the dog for a walk after he left for the marina. The timeline was too tight, and it didn't match up. Then came the odd behavior. Scott told police that he had gone fishing at the Berkeley Marina, a location 90 miles away. When asked what he had caught, he replied nothing, and offered an oddly detailed list of the types of fish he had hoped to catch. Yet he couldn't explain why he had driven such a long distance on Christmas Eve, especially given his heavily pregnant wife. Even more curious, police later learned that Scott had purchased the boat he used for the trip just 2 weeks prior, and had not told anyone about it, not even Laci. Detectives believed the boat was key. They theorized that Scott had killed Laci the night of December 23rd, or early morning December 24th, loaded her body into his boat, and dumped her in the San Francisco Bay. This theory aligned with where the remains of Laci and Connor were found, for months later, along the rocky shoreline near the same marina. Amber Frey became a central witness. Calm and composed, she testified about her relationship with Scott, the lies he told, and the calls they exchanged after Laci went missing. The jury listened intently as her voice echoed in the courtroom through taped phone conversations. On one recording, Scott told Amber he was in Paris, when in fact he was attending a vigil for Laci in California. Another time, he whispered sweet nothings to her while volunteers were out searching for his missing wife. The recordings were damning, but the defense fought back. They cross-examined Amber, questioning whether she had personal motives. They challenged the scientific credibility of decomposition timelines and argued that the San Francisco Bay was too unpredictable for Scott to have known the bodies would wash ashore. They highlighted the lack of forensic evidence in the Peterson home. No blood, no signs of struggle. And they focused on the fact that even with intense media scrutiny and public interest, no one had actually seen Scott commit the crime. As the trial dragged on for months, public interest surged. Viewers across the country followed every detail as if it were a TV drama. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered. Some held signs supporting Scott, others screamed for justice. News anchors offered nightly updates, and armchair detectives posted theories online. It was one of the first major trials of the 21st century to be shaped so completely by the 24-hour news cycle. Meanwhile, Scott's demeanor in court raised eyebrows. He rarely showed emotion. He barely reacted when Amber testified. He didn't cry when photos of Laci were shown. His detachment became part of the prosecution's narrative, that Scott Peterson was cold, calculated, and lacked the ability to feel remorse. The medical examiner testified about the remains. Laci's torso had been found without limbs or a head. No cause of death could be determined due to the extent of decomposition. But there were signs of a possible cut on the upper torso and injuries that could have indicated restraint. Baby Connor's remains were more intact, and he was believed to have been expelled from Laci's body as a result of decomposition, not a separate delivery. Though the defense pushed back on the forensics, the jury appeared shaken by the graphic testimony. As the trial neared its conclusion, prosecutors made a powerful emotional appeal. They showed photos of Laci, smiling and pregnant. They reminded the jury of the plans she had made for Christmas: shopping lists, nursery designs, names. They replayed Scott's recorded calls with Amber, his calculated lies, and his apparent disinterest in Laci's fate. They called Scott's fishing trip a cover story and asked the jury to see through it. The defense urged the jury to focus on reasonable doubt. No murder weapon had been found. The cause of death was unknown. Scott had never confessed. They insisted the case was fueled by gossip, media pressure, and public outrage, not facts. Then came the verdict. On November 12, 2004, nearly 2 years after Laci first disappeared, the jury found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder in the death of their unborn son, Connor. The courtroom erupted in gasps and tears. Outside, a crowd celebrated. Some wept. Others chanted Laci's name. A month later, during the penalty phase, the jury recommended the death penalty. The judge agreed. Scott Peterson was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison, California's infamous death row. He remained there for years, launching appeal after appeal, even as public interest in the case slowly faded. Some questioned the death penalty decision. Others believed he had gotten exactly what he deserved. For Laci's family, the verdict brought justice, but not peace. Sharon Rocha said she would never stop missing her daughter. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone that never came was a painful reminder of what had been lost. Connor's life had been stolen before it began. The nursery remained empty. Years later, the case continues to echo in American culture. Books have been written, documentaries filmed, podcasts re-examined every detail. And though some supporters argue Scott did not receive a fair trial, the majority of public opinion still sees him as a man who killed his pregnant wife and tried to move on like nothing had happened. It is a story of betrayal and loss, of a woman full of life and promise, and of a husband who traded his family for freedom he never got. In the wake of the guilty verdict and Scott Peterson's death sentence, the media whirlwind that had surrounded the case began to quiet, but only slightly. The conclusion of the trial marked a major chapter's end in a story that had captivated and polarized the nation. Yet for Laci's family, it was not closure. For Scott's supporters, it was just the beginning of a legal battle they believed was far from over. After the sentencing, Scott Peterson was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, located on the bay just north of San Francisco. It was a chilling twist of fate that he would spend his days staring out at the very waters where prosecutors said he had disposed of his wife's body. San Quentin's death row was notorious, not only for its hardened inmates but for the fact that California, despite having the death penalty, had executed very few prisoners in recent decades. Scott's cell was tiny. He was kept in almost complete isolation for 23 hours a day. No contact visits, no physical touch from loved ones, and a life that revolved around appeals, legal paperwork, and limited interaction. He quickly became inmate number P39400, one of more than 700 inmates awaiting execution on California's death row. Laci's family, especially her mother Sharon Rocha, remained active in the public eye. Sharon spoke candidly about grief, the criminal justice process, and the hole left in their lives. She wrote a memoir titled For Laci, where she detailed the emotional roller coaster of the investigation and trial. She used her voice to advocate for victims' rights and supported legislation that would recognize unborn children as separate victims in criminal cases, a law that eventually became known as Laci and Connor's Law. But while Laci's family worked to preserve her legacy, Scott's legal team began the long, winding process of appealing his conviction and sentence. His defense argued that the trial had been fundamentally unfair. Their claims focused on several key issues: the overwhelming pretrial publicity, alleged juror misconduct, and the exclusion of evidence that they believed could have helped Scott. In particular, the defense claimed that the jury had been tainted by the media frenzy. The Peterson case had been covered relentlessly for 2 years: television, newspapers, radio, tabloids. The photos of Laci's smiling face, the dramatic tapes of Amber Fry, and the damning testimony had all saturated the public consciousness. The defense insisted that no truly impartial jury could have been found. Moreover, a troubling detail emerged after the trial. One of the jurors had failed to disclose that she had once sought a restraining order against her boyfriend's ex-girlfriend while pregnant, an omission that raised serious questions about her impartiality. Nicknamed Strawberry Shortcake for her bright red hair, this juror had been particularly outspoken during deliberations, and the defense team seized on the possibility that she had been biased from the start. Scott's appeals moved slowly through the legal system. The California Supreme Court, by law, reviewed all death penalty cases. It would take over a decade before any decision was made. In the meantime, Scott's defense began building a campaign around his innocence, gaining attention from media outlets and true crime enthusiasts who believed his trial had been more of a public spectacle than a fair legal proceeding. In 2012, a new effort was launched by the California Innocence Project and other legal analysts who questioned whether Scott could have received a fair trial in the first place. They pointed to the fact that no one had ever witnessed a crime, and that Laci's remains had shown no definitive cause of death. Some questioned whether the bodies had even been in the San Francisco Bay the entire time, arguing that the tidal conditions and decomposition timeline left room for doubt. But none of these claims were conclusive. For most observers, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Scott's behavior, his lies, his affair, his bizarre calmness in the face of tragedy, spoke volumes. His strange fishing trip, his hidden boat purchase, and the consistent trail of deception painted a picture that many believed only had one explanation. Still, public interest in the case was renewed in 2015, when a series of investigative documentaries aired, including investigation discovery specials and a highly watched Dateline NBC feature. Each explored alternative theories, highlighted inconsistencies in the timeline, and interviewed figures close to the case. Some viewers were left wondering if the media had oversimplified the narrative, or if the justice system had failed to explore all angles. In August 2020, after years of review, the California Supreme Court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence, citing significant errors in jury selection during the trial. They ruled that prospective jurors had been dismissed improperly simply because they had expressed opposition to the death penalty, even if they had promised to follow the law. The court did not overturn his conviction, but determined that a new penalty phase trial would be necessary if prosecutors wished to seek death again. The decision stunned the public. While Scott remained in prison and his murder conviction held firm, the possibility that he could avoid the death penalty reignited fierce debate. Laci's family expressed disappointment and frustration, especially given the emotional toll the original trial had taken on them. They had relived their trauma day after day in court, and now they might have to endure it all over again. In December 2021, Scott was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This new sentence ensured he would never be free, but it removed the symbolic weight of the death penalty, something that many, including Sharon Rocha, had seen as a form of justice for Laci and Connor. Meanwhile, Scott continued to push for a full retrial. In 2022, a court held an evidentiary hearing to determine whether his conviction should be overturned based on the juror misconduct claims. Witnesses were called, including the juror herself, and both sides presented arguments. In October 2022, the judge ruled against Scott, finding no grounds to overturn the conviction. He would remain in prison for life. By this point, 2 decades had passed since Laci disappeared. The world had changed. Social media now dominated public discourse, and true crime had become a massive entertainment genre. New audiences discovered the Peterson case through Netflix documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube videos. But for those who had lived through the ordeal in real time, the pain remained raw. The case had become more than a tragedy. It was a cultural touchstone, symbolizing everything from the dangers of media sensationalism to the dark realities of domestic violence. For many, Scott Peterson was a cautionary tale about charming facades, the silent warning signs in a seemingly perfect marriage, and how tragedy can lurk beneath the surface. Despite every twist, every appeal, and every headline, one truth endured: Laci Peterson was gone. So was Connor, and no legal ruling could ever bring them back. From the moment Laci Peterson was reported missing, the case drew the attention of local news in Modesto, California. What began as regional concern quickly exploded into a national obsession. In an era before true crime documentaries and social media became the norm, the Peterson case was one of the earliest examples of a missing person case turned media phenomenon. Fueled by 24-hour news cycles, satellite interviews, and the public's fascination with betrayal, tragedy, and appearances gone wrong. Laci was beautiful, glowing, and 8 months pregnant. She seemed like the picture of domestic happiness. Her husband, Scott, was clean-cut, handsome, and soft-spoken. Their home was decorated for Christmas, a golden retriever roamed the backyard, and a nursery waited for the arrival of baby Connor. To many, it was the American dream, shattered. News crews descended on Modesto within days. Local law enforcement initially welcomed the publicity, hoping it would bring leads, especially as they canvassed neighborhoods, interviewed neighbors, and searched nearby parks and lakes. Police encouraged public involvement, distributing flyers with Laci's photo and hosting press conferences. But as Scott's behavior began to raise questions, the media's tone shifted. He was no longer the grieving husband. He was the likely suspect. One of the most powerful catalysts for that transformation was the revelation of Scott's affair with Amber Frey. When the public learned that Scott had not only cheated on his pregnant wife, but lied to his mistress about being widowed even before Laci's disappearance, it shattered his credibility. The press latched onto it with relentless focus. National outlets like CNN, Fox News, and Court TV followed every development. Tabloids ran with lurid headlines, and late-night talk shows openly mocked Scott's lies. Amber Frey herself became a figure of media scrutiny. After contacting the police in early January 2003, she agreed to cooperate with the investigation and secretly recorded dozens of phone calls with Scott. In these calls, Scott claimed to be traveling in Paris on New Year's Eve, mourning the loss of his wife, a loss that had not yet occurred in real time. The recordings were played during the trial, painting Scott as manipulative and emotionally detached. The public was riveted. Meanwhile, Laci's family made frequent appearances on television, pleading for information and expressing their heartbreak. Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, was especially vocal, her grief raw and palpable. Her unwavering dedication to finding justice for her daughter made her a sympathetic figure and further emphasized the cruelty of Scott's deception. Viewers across the country sided with her. But the Peterson case was not just about a single crime, it was a mirror for societal issues. Discussions around domestic abuse, emotional manipulation, and the vulnerability of women in intimate relationships flooded talk shows and editorial pages. Some analysts likened Scott's detachment to the behavior of sociopaths. Others debated whether circumstantial evidence was enough to convict a man of murder. The public weighed in on everything from body language to tone of voice, dissecting Scott's every word. The media coverage reached a fever pitch during the trial in 2004. Seats in the courtroom were coveted. Reporters filed hourly updates, sketch artists captured courtroom moments, and legal analysts like Nancy Grace and Greta Van Susteren delivered nightly commentary. The trial was not televised, but the country followed along as if it were a reality show. Viewers knew the names of the prosecutors, jurors, and even minor witnesses. The story was more than a murder, it was a spectacle. And like all spectacles, public opinion wasn't always rational. People divided into camps: those who believed in Scott's guilt unequivocally, and a smaller but vocal group who questioned the fairness of his trial. The latter raised issues about media bias, the presumption of innocence, and whether Scott was convicted in the court of public opinion long before a jury heard the facts. There were comparisons to other infamous cases: the O.J. Simpson trial in the 1990s, the JonBenet Ramsey investigation, and later, the Casey Anthony trial. Each case involved beautiful victims, complex suspects, and intense media coverage. In Laci's case, the perfect suburban image made the betrayal feel more intimate and personal to the public. By 2005, Scott Peterson had become a household name. His mugshot, images of Laci's smiling face, and the now iconic flyer with her pregnant silhouette were burned into the national consciousness. True crime books were published, television specials aired annually, and conspiracy theories circulated online. Some believed Scott had been framed. Others believed additional suspects had been ignored. But the majority saw it as a cautionary tale about appearances, lies, and the tragic outcomes of emotional detachment. Years later, the media's role in the case continued to be debated. Legal experts examined whether the saturation of negative coverage affected jury selection, and if Scott's right to a fair trial had been compromised. In fact, the California Supreme Court later acknowledged that errors were made during jury selection. One of the reasons Scott's death sentence was overturned in 2020. The influence of media wasn't just confined to the legal system. It affected the lives of everyone connected to the case. Amber Frey struggled with the aftermath of sudden national attention. She published a memoir in 2005 and gave several interviews, but eventually retreated from the public eye to protect her family. Sharon Rocha became an advocate for victims' rights, appearing at events and testifying before lawmakers. Scott's defense team also used the media in their own way, especially in later years. They cooperated with documentaries and true crime podcasts that questioned the investigation. Some argued that police had tunnel vision, focusing too quickly on Scott and ignoring other leads. One such theory involved reported sightings of Laci on Christmas Eve near a park, or the burglary that took place across the street from the Peterson home during the same time period. Yet despite all the noise, the legal conclusion remained unchanged. Scott was convicted. Laci and Connor were gone, and the case became one of the most studied, dissected, and emotionally charged murder cases in modern American history. The legacy of the media's role in the Peterson case is complex. On one hand, it brought attention to a missing woman and helped pressure authorities to act swiftly. On the other, it arguably contributed to a rush to judgment and turned a deeply tragic story into entertainment. As true crime became a booming genre in the 2010s and 2020s, many producers revisited the case, asking what could be learned from it, not just about crime, but about how stories are told, consumed, and remembered. Laci Peterson's name endures, not as a headline, but as a symbol, a reminder that beneath the coverage, the analysis, and the endless opinions was a woman with a family, a future, and a life that deserved more than a tragic end. The trial of Scott Peterson began on June 1, 2004, with the nation watching closely. From the very start, it was clear that the case would be filled with drama, emotion, and twists that would capture the public's attention. Judge Nancy Ashley presided over the proceedings, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. A full jury was selected, and soon, opening statements would set the stage for the next phase of what seemed to be a never-ending legal battle. The prosecution, led by District Attorney James Brazelton, had one key goal: to prove that Scott Peterson had murdered his wife, Laci, and their unborn son, Connor, on Christmas Eve in 2002. They argued that Scott, tired of his marriage and wanting to be with his mistress, Amber Fry, planned the murders with chilling precision. The prosecution's case was based not on direct evidence, but on circumstantial evidence. Scott's lies, his behavior after Laci went missing, and the fact that the bodies of Laci and Connor were found in the exact location he had claimed to have been fishing that fateful day. Amber Fry took the stand as a key witness for the prosecution, recounting her affair with Scott and the months of deceit he had subjected her to. Her testimony about the phone calls she had recorded was crucial. In these calls, Scott had pretended to be a grieving husband, telling Amber he had lost his wife. The recordings were deeply damaging to Scott's credibility. The defense, led by Mark Garagos, aimed to poke holes in the prosecution's case. They argued that the evidence was not strong enough to convict Scott, suggesting instead that Laci's death could have been the result of an unknown assailant. Garagos also attempted to cast doubt on Scott's motive, pointing out inconsistencies in the timeline and suggesting that Scott was an innocent man caught up in a media frenzy. Throughout the trial, Scott's demeanor was notably calm, often appearing disengaged or uninterested in the proceedings. He sat motionless, dressed in a suit, with his hands folded on the table in front of him. To many, this lack of visible emotion seemed odd, especially for a man accused of such horrific crimes. His behavior became one of the most discussed aspects of the case. The trial dragged on for months. Witnesses testified, forensic evidence was presented, and expert opinions were debated. Throughout, the media remained glued to every detail, and the nation's obsession with the case grew stronger by the day. Finally, after 12 weeks of testimony, closing arguments were delivered. The prosecution emphasized Scott's lies, his strange behavior, and the fact that he had been so close to the crime scene. The defense, on the other hand, reminded the jury that no physical evidence connected Scott to the murders, and there were too many unanswered questions for them to return a guilty verdict. The jury deliberated for 7 days, carefully considering the evidence presented. On November 12, 2004, they returned to the courtroom with a verdict. The air in the room was thick with anticipation as the jury foreperson stood to read the decision. "Guilty," the foreperson announced. Scott Peterson was convicted of 2 counts of murder, one for Laci Peterson and one for the death of their unborn son, Connor. The verdict sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the nation. Laci's family, particularly her mother, Sharon Rocha, burst into tears as they embraced one another. They had waited so long for justice, and now it had finally come. The sentencing phase of the trial began shortly after the verdict. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that Scott's actions were especially heinous because he had killed his wife and child with no remorse. The defense pleaded for mercy, citing Scott's lack of a criminal record and his apparent remorse. On December 12, 2004, Scott Peterson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. His face remained stoic as the judge handed down the sentence, but his family's grief was evident. They had never wavered in their support of Scott, but the court's decision was now final. For Laci's family, the verdict brought a sense of relief, but no true closure. Laci would never be coming back, and neither would Connor. The pain of their loss would stay with them forever, even as they now knew that Scott Peterson would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The aftermath of the case saw Scott Peterson placed on death row at San Quentin State Prison. In the years that followed, appeals would be filed, and there would be ongoing legal battles regarding the fairness of his trial. But for the most part, the public had made up their mind. Scott Peterson was guilty of a cold-blooded murder. Laci Peterson's legacy would live on, not only through the grief of her family, but also in the countless laws and initiatives that sought to improve the way cases of domestic violence, missing persons, and murder were handled. Laci's story became a catalyst for change, inspiring legislation to protect pregnant women and their unborn children. In 2021, Scott Peterson's death sentence was overturned due to errors in jury selection during his original trial. While his conviction remained intact, the sentence was reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The news rekindled public debate, with some expressing frustration that Scott Peterson's sentence was reduced, while others believed the appeal process had followed the letter of the law. But for Laci's family, it didn't change the fact that Scott Peterson was a murderer and he would never be free again. As for Scott, he remains in prison, serving his sentence without parole. Despite the legal battles, he maintains his innocence, though few believe him. The tragic events of Christmas 2002 have left an indelible mark on everyone involved, from Laci's family to the millions who followed the case. The death of Laci Peterson remains one of the most notorious and heartbreaking crimes of the early 21st century, a case that continues to haunt the American consciousness. In the end, justice was served, but it came at a tremendous cost. For Laci, for Connor, and for all those who loved them, the pain of loss will never be fully healed.